Savannah, Georgia, the night before my wedding. I was walking back from the rehearsal dinner down the quiet hallway of the Riverside Hotel. Warm light spilled from the ballroom laughter echoing behind closed doors. I wasn't looking for trouble. I just wanted some air. But then I heard my name. Through a gap in the door, I saw my fiancée, Rachel, standing with her parents. They were sipping champagne, smiling, and then I heard it. She was ordinary, Cynthia said. Nothing special, Edward added, and Rachel laughed. They were talking about my mother, my late mother. Marilyn Hayes, the woman who worked double shifts at the diner and still made it home to tuck me in. The woman who kept a thimble in her pocket and a smile on her face no matter how hard life got. The woman who taught me that dignity was worth more than any amount of money. And here they were, reducing her entire life to ordinary. I stood frozen, my hands clenched, my chest tight. They didn't know I was listening. They didn't know that every word was burning itself into me like a brand. By tomorrow night, they would regret it. Every single word. Because this isn't just a story about a wedding. It's a story about justice. It's about the one moment you realize that love without respect isn't love at all. If you've ever believed in standing up for what's right, stick around. You'll want to hear how this ends. My name is Daniel Hayes. I'm 36 years old and I build guitars by hand in Savannah, Georgia. Every piece I make starts the same way with raw wood and an idea. My shop smells of cedar and mahogany, and the air is always filled with the quiet hum of sandpaper against grain. People say my instruments have a soul. I tell them that's because they carry the rhythm of the life I've lived. I didn't grow up in music stores or fancy studios. I grew up in a small one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on Habersham Street. My mother, Marilyn Hayes, worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs to keep the lights on. She was a waitress, a seamstress, and on weekends she cleaned offices downtown. She never complained. She never asked for help, and she carried herself with a dignity that had nothing to do with money. The only thing of value she ever owned was a white handkerchief she had embroidered herself, a delicate D in the corner for Daniel. She kept it folded neatly in her pocket like a small piece of pride she could carry anywhere. That handkerchief sits in my shop, now framed above my workbench. Every time I pick up a chisel, I see it. And I remember what she taught me. If you can't do something with pride, don't do it at all. I had no idea standing there in that sawdust-scented room that the values she stitched into me would soon be tested in front of 200 people. And that night, my craft would become my weapon. My mother, Marilyn Hayes, was the kind of woman people remembered not because of what she had, but because of who she was. She stood just 5'3", but somehow she filled every room she walked into. Maybe it was her voice, warm, steady always, with a hint of humor. Or maybe it was the way she looked you straight in the eye, like you were the most important person in the world at that moment. We didn't have much living above that laundromat on Habersham Street, but she made it feel like we had everything. She'd cook simple meals, cornbread, vegetable soup, and somehow they tasted better than anything money could buy. When the world tried to make her small, she refused. She ironed her uniform until every crease was sharp. She wore her hair neatly pinned, and she carried that white handkerchief with the embroidered D like a badge of honor. I used to watch her fold it, tuck it into her pocket, and smile as if to say, "We may not have much, but we have pride." She taught me the value of showing up every day, no matter how tired, no matter how hard. She taught me that respect is earned by how you treat people, not by the size of your paycheck. I thought everyone who came into my life would see her the way I did. I thought they'd feel her presence in the way I carried myself, but I was wrong. And on the night before my wedding, I would find out just how wrong I was. I met Rachel Bennett on a Saturday morning at the Forsyth Park Artisan Market. The air smelled of fresh coffee and blooming azaleas. I was set up under a canvas tent, my guitars lined up in neat rows, their polished wood catching the sunlight. Most people walked by, glancing at the price tags before moving on. But Rachel didn't. She picked up one of my smaller builds, a cedar parlor guitar, and ran her fingers lightly over the strings. "How long does something like this take?" she asked. I told her about selecting the wood, the months of curing, the hours of hand-shaping each curve. She didn't just nod politely. She leaned in, asked about my tools, the patterns I carved into the soundboard. She was beautiful, yes, chestnut hair, green eyes, the kind of posture that came from years of private schooling. but it was the interest in her voice that caught me off guard. Before she left, she bought that guitar. The next weekend, she came back, said she wanted a matching stand. The weekend after that, she brought coffee and stayed the whole morning talking about music travel and how she admired people who built things with their hands. By the end of that month, we'd gone on 3 dates. She seemed curious about my world, my work, even my small apartment above the shop. I thought, maybe she saw me the way my mother would have wanted someone to see me. I didn't realize then that first impressions can be crafted just like a guitar. And sometimes the wood hides cracks you can't see until it's too late. The first time I met the Bennetts was over dinner at the Grey Heron, an upscale seafood place overlooking the Savannah River. Rachel's father, Edward Bennett, shook my hand with a grip that felt more like a measurement than a greeting. Her mother, Cynthia, smiled warmly, but her eyes scanned me the way a jeweler inspects a stone, searching for flaws. They were the kind of people who spoke in low, confident tones, never rushed, always certain the world would wait for them. Edward owned a chain of fine dining restaurants along the Georgia coast. Cynthia managed a private investment fund and chaired half a dozen charity boards. They asked about my work, not just polite questions, but specifics. How many guitars did I make a year? What did they sell for? Did I have employees, or was it just me? I told them the truth. It was just me. And that's how I liked it. Cynthia tilted her head and said, "There's something admirable about simple operations." Her words were sweet, but the pause before simple told me everything. Dinner was flawless linen napkins, silver cutlery scallops, plated like art. But between the courses, I caught small glances between them, like they were silently agreeing on a verdict. Rachel didn't seem to notice. She laughed, told stories, brushed my hand under the table. I wanted to believe she saw me for who I was not, through the lens of her parents' standards. But as we left the restaurant, Edward clapped my shoulder and said, "You've done well for yourself, considering." At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. I would far too clearly the night before our wedding. From the very first planning meeting, it was clear this wedding was going to be a Bennett production. The venue, a historic riverside mansion just outside Savannah, with white columns sprawling oak trees draped in Spanish moss, and a lawn that looked like it belonged in a magazine. The guest list, over 200 names, most of them Edward's business associates, Cynthia's charity contacts, and Rachel's sorority sisters from college. When I suggested a smaller, more personal gathering, Cynthia smiled and said, "Daniel, a wedding is a statement. This one will reflect the right standards." The budget quickly soared past what I earned in a year. Edward waved it off, insisting it's what fathers do. Every time I tried to contribute more, he brushed me aside with a pat on the back, as if money were the only way to show love. I told myself it didn't matter, that the details, the gold-edged invitations, the imported crystal centerpieces weren't what made a marriage. But every decision seemed to come with a subtle reminder, you're here because we allow it. Rachel seemed swept up in it all, dress fittings in Atlanta, cake tastings flown in from Charleston. She'd send me pictures of floral arrangements that looked like they belonged in royal gardens. And yet somewhere under the excitement, I felt a quiet distance growing. I didn't know it yet, but this wedding wasn't just about joining two families. It was a stage. And on that stage, the Bennetts were already writing their script for me, one where I would play a role I never agreed to. It started small, little comments slipped into conversations, the kind you could almost convince yourself you imagined. One afternoon, we were reviewing table settings in Cynthia's sunroom. She held up a menu card and said, "Your mother would have appreciated something simple like this." Her tone was light, almost pleasant, but simple landed like a pebble in my shoe, small but impossible to ignore. At the florist's, Edward ran his hand over a bouquet of white roses and said, "Classy, nothing like the carnations your mother probably liked." He smiled as if it were a harmless joke. Rachel was there both times. She didn't correct them, didn't defend me. She just moved the conversation along, her voice a little too bright, like she didn't want to notice. The more I heard, the more I started replaying other moments. A toast where Edward said I had done well for someone with no connections. A fundraiser where Cynthia introduced me as self-taught, with the same tone you might use to describe a rescued stray. They never outright insulted me. No, they were too refined for that. Their words were dressed in silk, but the stitching was pure condescension. I told myself to let it go, that they were from a different world, And maybe they didn't realize how they sounded, but deep down I knew. They understood exactly what they were saying. And they were only getting started. Early in our engagement, Rachel had promised me something that meant more than any venue or menu choice. She would honor my mother in her speech. She said she wanted people to know who Marilyn Hayes was, to understand the values she had passed down to me. I remember feeling my chest tighten with gratitude. In a wedding drowning in luxury, that one moment would be ours. 2 weeks before the big day, I asked how her speech was coming along. She smiled and said, "Almost done. I think it's going to be perfect." But 3 days before the wedding, during a final review with the planner, I noticed something missing from her printed notes. My mother's name. When I asked, Rachel didn't look guilty. She looked calculated. "Daniel, it just doesn't fit the tone," she said. "This is supposed to be a celebration, not a biography." I stared at her, trying to find the woman from the market, the one who listened to me talk about my mother's handkerchief as if it mattered. "She matters to me," I said. Rachel reached for my hand, her smile gentle but empty. "I know, but let's keep things elegant. Elegant. Like my mother's life wasn't." That was the first crack I couldn't patch over. The first time I realized Rachel wasn't just staying silent while her parents looked down on me, she was starting to speak their language. And once you start speaking it, it gets easier to say worse. The rehearsal dinner was held at the Magnolia Room, a private hall inside one of Edward's flagship restaurants on the Savannah waterfront. White linens, crystal stemware, the hum of polite laughter. It was everything the Bennetts loved to showcase. Dinner had gone smoothly. I laughed when I was supposed to shake hands with people I barely knew. Let Rachel squeeze my arm when her sorority friends complimented the ring. Around 8:30, I excused myself, saying I needed some air. Instead of heading straight outside, I wandered toward the side hallway that led past the bar. That's when I heard my name. I slowed footsteps muffled by the carpet and saw them, Edward, Cynthia, and Rachel, standing near the tall windows, champagne flutes in hand. Cynthia's voice was low, but clear enough, carnations and baby's breath, like something from a gas station. Edward chuckled. "What do you expect? She was a waitress. Probably never saw real flowers in her life." And then Rachel laughed. Not a nervous laugh, a shared laugh. "She wasn't even that special," Edward added. "Raised a son, then died. That's about it." The words landed like glass shattering inside me. My chest tightened. My hands curled into fists. For a moment, I considered walking and confronting them, but I didn't. I just stood there memorizing every word, every smirk. They didn't know I was listening, and by tomorrow night, they would wish I hadn't been. I walked back into the Magnolia Room like nothing had happened, smiled when someone refilled my glass, nodded along to Edward's stories about opening his first restaurant. But inside, something had shifted like a string pulled too tight on one of my guitars, ready to snap. I kept my eyes on Rachel across the table. She was radiant, laughing with her bridesmaids, completely unaware that I had heard every cruel word. Or maybe she knew and didn't care. All through dessert, my mind kept replaying my mother's face, the lines at the corners of her eyes, the way her hands smelled faintly of lemon dish soap. After a long shift, the soft fold of that white handkerchief she always carried. By the time coffee was served, I knew exactly what I had to do. Not in anger, not in a burst of shouting that would give them the satisfaction of calling me emotional or uncivilized. No, this would be quiet, surgical, the kind of strike that leaves no doubt who it's aimed at. When the night ended, Rachel kissed my cheek and said, "Tomorrow's going to be perfect." I smiled and said, "Yes, it will." But my definition of perfect had changed. Because tomorrow, I wouldn't just marry into the Bennett family. I would dismantle the image they built in front of every single person they wanted to impress. And when it was over, they remembered my mother's name. For all the right reasons. That night, I drove home alone. The streets of Savannah were quiet, the lamps along River Street casting long gold reflections over the water. I didn't turn on the TV, didn't check my phone. I went straight to my workbench, the place where I'd always gone to think. The framed handkerchief hung above me, the stitched D catching the light. My original wedding speech was still in my notebook, full of sweet lines about love, commitment, and joining two families. I read it once, then tore it out and dropped it in the trash. This wedding wasn't about love anymore. It was about truth. I started writing a new speech. Not vindictive, not cruel, just honest. I would tell the room exactly what I'd heard, exactly who these people were when they thought no one was listening. And I would do it in a way that left no room for denial. By midnight, the pages were full. I read them aloud, making small adjustments, trimming any excess, until every word landed like a chisel against hardwood. When I was done, I slid the pages into my jacket pocket. Tomorrow, I would smile, play the perfect groom, and wait until my moment came. Because the Bennetts thought they knew the stage. But I was about to steal the spotlight. The morning of the wedding broke clear and warm, the kind of Savannah day people dream about. Sunlight filtered through the Spanish moss outside my window, and for a moment, it almost felt like a fresh start. Tyler, my best man, showed up with coffee and a paper bag of breakfast sandwiches. "You ready for the big day?" he asked. I smiled and said, "More than you know." We got dressed in the small suite above the venue navy suits for the groomsmen, a white rose pinned to my lapel. I checked my jacket pocket twice to make sure the folded pages were still there. Guests began arriving, their voices carrying across the manicured lawn. I shook hands, posed for pictures, even laughed at Edward's rehearsed jokes. Rachel walked down the aisle in a lace gown that seemed to catch every drop of sunlight. She was beautiful, untouchably so. The ceremony went off without a hitch. Reverend Collins spoke about unity and devotion, and Rachel and I exchanged vows, hers delivered with the same bright, flawless smile she'd worn since morning. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, she kissed me like nothing in the world could be wrong. If anyone had looked closely, they might have seen the difference in our eyes, hers full of certainty, mine fixed on the moment that was still to come. Because as perfect as the day seemed, it wasn't the happily ever after they thought it was. It was only the first act. The reception hall glowed under strings of warm lights, the air rich with the scent of gardenias and roasted prime rib. Glasses clinked, laughter rippled, and for the Bennetts everything was unfolding like the perfect society page spread. Edward took the microphone first, his voice smooth as he thanked the guests and toasted to family, the most important thing in life. Polite applause followed. Rachel beamed at me, her hand resting lightly on mine. Then it was my turn. I stood unfolding the pages from my pocket. "Thank you all for being here tonight." I began, my voice steady. "It means everything to have you witness what family really is, and what it isn't." I spoke about my mother, Marilyn Hayes, her strength, her dignity, the pride she carried even when life gave her nothing but scraps. I saw Rachel's smile falter. Cynthia's glass paused halfway to her lips. Then I told them what I'd overheard the night before, word for word. The carnations, the gas station flowers. She wasn't even that special. The room fell silent except for the low hum of the air conditioning. I let the weight of it sit before I continued. My mother's greatest accomplishment wasn't wealth or status. It was raising a son who knows the value of respect, and I will not marry someone who disrespects her memory. I took off my ring and set it on the table. The tiny metallic clink echoed through the hall. "Please enjoy the evening. Dinner's on me." And then I walked out, leaving the Bennetts and 200 witnesses in stunned silence. As I reached the doorway of the reception hall, I stopped. 200 pairs of eyes were still locked on me. The weight of the silence was electric. I turned back, walked to the microphone, and said, "One more thing." From my jacket, I pulled out a small wooden frame. Inside was my mother's handkerchief, white linen, the embroidered D still crisp after all these years. I held it up so everyone could see. This, I said, is the most valuable thing I own. My mother carried it every day she worked, whether she was waiting tables, sewing late into the night, or cleaning offices on weekends. It's not worth much to anyone else, but to me it's priceless. I could see guests leaning forward, the tension shifting from shock to quiet reverence. I'm starting a scholarship in her name, the Marilyn Hayes Memorial Fund, for kids who've lost a parent and are being raised by someone who works as hard as she did. Tonight, I'm donating what would have been our honeymoon fund to start it. There was a long pause before the first clap, then another, and then half the room was on its feet. Edward and Cynthia stayed seated, faces frozen. Rachel looked like she just swallowed glass. I stepped away from the mic, handed the handkerchief frame to Tyler, and walked out for the last time. Outside, the air was cool, the river just a block away. I felt lighter with every step. Some endings burn. This one shone. I walked along the Savannah River, the warm glow from the street lamp stretching across the dark water. The sounds of the reception, muffled voices, clinking glasses faded behind me. For the first time in months, my shoulders felt light. This wasn't the ending I had imagined when Rachel and I got engaged. It wasn't the life I'd been planning for. But standing there, the cool night air against my face, I realized it was the ending I needed. I thought about my mother, Marilyn Hayes, how she had taught me that respect isn't given freely, it's earned. How she believed that dignity is worth more than any ring, any banquet hall, any last name. Tonight, I hadn't just defended her memory. I had reclaimed a part of myself I didn't even realize I'd been letting slip away. Some people think revenge is about anger, about hurting someone back. But real revenge, it's walking away with your head high while the people who tried to diminish you sit in their own silence. The Bennetts might still have their mansion, their guest list, their polished silverware, but I had something they couldn't buy: the truth. And that truth would follow them long after the lights in that reception hall went dark. I took one last look at the river, slipped my hands into my pockets, and started walking home. Sometimes the cleanest break is the most beautiful thing you can make. In the weeks that followed, the story spread further than I ever imagined. Someone at the wedding had recorded my speech, and within days it was everywhere shared, reshared, commented on by strangers who saw themselves in my words. Vendors quietly cut ties with the Bennetts. Edward lost 2 major investors. Cynthia stepped down from one of her charity boards. But for me, the focus wasn't on their downfall. It was on what I could build. The Marilyn Hayes Memorial Fund began with the money I'd saved for the honeymoon, but then donations started coming in from single parents, from grown kids who'd been raised by them, from people who just believed in the cause. Within a year, we had given our first scholarships. Life didn't suddenly become easy. I still worked long hours in my shop, but I worked for something that felt bigger than myself, and that changes everything. And as for love, I haven't closed that door. I've just learned to keep it locked until someone earns the key. If you've made it this far into my story, you already know life will test you. Some people will try to write your script for you. Don't let them. And if you want to hear more stories about standing up, walking away, and taking back your power, well, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button. Join me for the next chapter. Because sometimes the best revenge is living the life they swore you couldn't.